Here are the actual tools needed to install the JHM pump kit into the factory pump assembly. This doesn't include removing or installing the pump into the car. Look at this factory service manual for that. So we have a die grinder, Dremel tool, sometimes just some longer cutters to get in there to help get the pump out of the original bottom base. So that's needed. Side cutters, dikes, whatever you want to call them. A pick to help get the clamps off. Small flat screwdriver to work with the smaller clamps and help getting them on and off. Phillips screwdriver, this is longer than needed. This is just what I had laying around. Razor blade helps at times. We're dealing with some of the hose removal. Measuring tape to deal with the length of the wires. Blow attachment for a compressor, or if you got some way to blow air. Even those little spray cans that they have for computers, the air cans to spray air to clean off all the parts really well. Good crimping tool. You want something where it's got the points that actually crimp correctly, not the flat crimpers don't work right. And then a heat gun. Hair dryer might work for a lot of these actually. This probably can get too hot. A hair dryer would just take longer. You just need to really warm up the lines so they just kind of come off and on real more easily. So that's the whole tool list to get this install done. We'll get to the install next. The purpose of this video is to show you how to assemble the JHM B7 A4 and RS4 high volume fuel pump kit, available both in 255 and 340 liter per hour. First, I'm going to show you the kit components. We got the pump. It's the same size for either the 255 or the 340. We got the pickup screen, and then there's a little clip that locks that screen onto the pump. We got the wiring pigtail and 2 butt connectors. Then for some of the plumbing, we have a T, a special one-way valve. It's critical how this gets installed. This is spec built to us for this kit. And then this nipple adapter. Then we have 2 hoses back here, 2 flexible hoses, and the 4 clamps for that. Then we have this little pinch clamp for the extra line that we need to reuse from the factory that helps equalize the 2 tanks side to side. Then have the 2 clamps that hold the pump to the JHM bracket. Then the 3 screws that mount the JHM bracket to the factory pump assembly. Last but not least, 2 zip ties. And of course you need your original pump assembly. This one's in pretty good shape still. Most of them tend to be burned up and throw the P310B code a lot. Now the first step we're going to do is we're going to prep the pump. So here's your factory fuel pump assembly, already removed from the car. Just comes in and out like factory service manual would dictate. Here's the level sensor. This is something you got to be very careful with. They don't fail very often, but just be very careful with it. I recommend at times just getting it out of the way. There's 2 clips in here on the back. You got to pull them down. Hard to see here, and it lifts out. So what I did, and the fuel pump does separate right here. You can see where it drops in. It's part of why we want to use the factory basket. It's for all the fitment for the fuel level sender and everything else. But these are the 2 tabs I pulled back on right here to slip this out. Just keep this out of the way. You don't want to bend it. You don't want to gouge the float. There's a potentiometer inside. So next we're going to do to prep it is we need to cut these zip ties off the hoses. They hold the wires. Be careful obviously of the small ones for the sender. This line slips out. This is for if it had factory heating. This one's plugged, so it just goes in that hole. Now that we have that, we need to get the pump out of the basket, and we need to get this hose off of the fuel pump lid, the large one. So factory pumps normally don't have this. And then we're going to have to get the lines off the pump. So you want to make sure it sits for a while and all the fuel is dissipated, because you're going to have to use a heat gun to get these lines off without damaging anything. You got to be careful using a knife and a razor on this one. You'll be damaging the green lid. And this line right here with the snap coupling that goes to the other side of the tank that keeps the tanks equalized, that has to come off the pump, and we need to reuse that line. It's not available separately. So like I said, always keep the level sender safe and separate. And then the next step, just to make it easy to see, I'm going to go ahead and cut the fuel pump out of here so we can get the basket out of the way. What you're going to do is you're just going to go down inside. You want to leave this whole top portion because our bracket's going to sit right here, and you need to make sure all these holes are still here and this is here. So you're going to just kind of cut down in here. You'll see down below, and then the pump will just come out. So we just need to get the pump out. It's just plastic. You can get in there with some dikes probably and cut it out, some end cutters like this. I like to use a die grinder, but if you see, you can get in there if you want to be tricky. It's like glued to the sidewalls underneath, but this top portion needs to stay. It's this part, this 3-pointed star that holds the pump itself. We need to get out of there, and you can cut it out and clean it up. I'll show you how it looks when it's done, and I'll tell you more about it. So now that I've got this ground up pretty good and it comes out, you'll find sometimes it's hard to get out. I actually had to take a screwdriver and shove off the blue pickup screen. So I just kind of went from the top, held the pump up a little bit, and just jabbed it off. That allowed it to come out a lot easier. You'll see it's messy, it's no big deal. We'll clean it up before we're done. You'll see how I had to cut around. You'll see a few spots I accidentally nicked it here, but it's fine. We just need this top surface here, and we need the holder for the level center to stay intact. So these little arms in here, I'm gonna probably cut them back a little more. This 1 arm, 2 arm, 3 arm. And I even, which is good to see, tapped into this little hole a little bit that something drops in. That's not a big deal. I wouldn't worry about that. This is just a holder. So you just clean everything up, get these, dialed back to make room for the new pump, deburr, blow it out, and you're good. The big other huge thing, since this factory pump has a very unique bottom, it's unavailable other from OEM pump. There's a orange checked one-way valve in the bottom that it's the only pump that can open it. This has to be removed. So this is massively important. This has to be removed for the new pump to be able to pull fuel in. The cool thing about this being removed, it also adds some increased flow, and this setup has gotten us into the 10-second quarter-mile range since 2013, 2014. So we've been running this pumping for a while. So this orange one-way valve has to be pulled out, no exceptions. And then the only downfall for this to being removed is if you have a high horsepower car or corner hard at low fuel pump levels, you'll notice a little bit of stumbling through corners, but this is only when you're low and we're about 40 miles left to the tank, which isn't advised for high acceleration anyways. So now I'm gonna go ahead and clean it out, deburr it a little bit, and I'll come back. Okay, now I got the basket fully cleaned out. You don't have to go all the way back, you just gotta make sure it's got a clear path right here because we're gonna drop the pump in this area. So the basket's pretty much ready. Also make sure you blow this out of any debris or any plastic. So we got the check valve out I spoke about earlier. The orange check valve needs to be removed. Make sure this is clean. Top needs to stay good. Just get it cut back enough and cleaned up. Use a screwdriver if needed to break off any of the hanging plastic. You can use a Dremel like I said before, some good cutters. Just keep the top of the lid safe and you'll be fine. So now we got the pump. This is a newer, updated pump. This is that factory siphon that can't be reused. And what I said, this is the updated pump. The replacement, they just generally ship the one that has the heating system, and you have to throw a cap on, so this is just a newer pump. You don't even need this unless you happen to have a line that hooks to this fitting, a third line. This car doesn't have it, so I'm just gonna delete that. Like I said, you can leave it, it doesn't matter. This one's capped off, not used. Most of the factory pumps don't even have this. So that's out of the way. The next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and just cut the wires to the pump. We can pull them off, it wouldn't matter. They're gonna be cut anyways. So then we have that. And now we have 2 lines. We're gonna go ahead and cut the big line to the pump, only cut the big line. We're gonna need to reuse this small line. So do not cut this small line. We're gonna have to get this off the pump. I'm just trying to get everything separated so it's easier to work with. So the big line to the pump can take some effort. So now we have the pump with just the secondary line. We have the lid with just wires, the fuel lever sender, like I said, need to keep safe and separate. So the next step is going to be using a heat gun right here to get this hose off. You can use a razor blade on this hose because we're not reusing it, but you got to be careful. If you gouge into here pretty good, you'll end up making it so it can have a small leak and the car might have starting issues. And then same with this fitting. This fitting, we're going to have to get this clamp loose. You can use a pick and a screwdriver. Don't worry if you accidentally break off the fitting from the pump, since the pump is not being reused. We have all the plumbing in order to reuse this system. This is critical, that's why we don't delete it. It keeps the tanks balanced. As you can see, it doesn't take much for it to move around. You kind of support it, and then now that I got it slid up. So now it's going to be heat gun down here to get the big line off, so the lid's ready. And it's going to be heat gun right here on the pump to go ahead and get this little line off that we're going to reuse. And this is why I say you got to make sure this thing sits out for a while and you get all the fuel fumes out of it. Heat guns are decently safe, they don't have open flame, but you obviously want to be careful. You want to do this in an open ventilated area, and we let this pump sit overnight so we didn't have to worry about any fumes. So do that at your own risk, but be very careful. You're going to have a heat gun. There's not a ton of fuel. It's not like it's going to explode, but you definitely want to do it in a well ventilated area. Let it vent out for a while because you need to get this off nicely with a heat gun just to warm it up enough so it'll just wiggle off. And same with on the lid. So a couple pointers when you use the heat gun. This upper lid is a lot harder than the ones I've done in the past. I haven't done a new one yet. I've always done older ones. I found that this, as I was warming it up, I just kind of got a screwdriver in there and loosened it up. Obviously you don't want to gouge the green, and if it starts bubbling, you'll see bubbles pop up on it. As soon as it starts bubbling, that's telling you it's too hot. So you want to back off. You can see this bubbled. I went ahead and cut this one once I had the screwdriver in there so I can get to it and get it off. And you'll still find they're not easy to get off. So I'm going to get here. Luckily this line you can destroy. See, there I go. Now I got that off. The big key is you don't want straight lines down it because it'll cause a leak to go through the line. So just be careful, take your time and get this off. Like I said, this was harder because this was a newer one. The older ones don't seem to be as bad. We got a new line, so this large line that went from the main line to the pump is now trash. So the lid is 100% prepped, and as always, we were safe with this. So we have no lines on here, and that's off to the side. So basket's prepped, lid's prepped, pump is now completely separated. Another trick on this little line, you can see I got it a little bit bubbly. Sometimes you gotta get a little bit warm. Be careful, as soon as it starts to bubble, back off. As long as you don't split it or break it, it'll be fine. This is just for helping equalizing the tanks. So I got it off. You'll find that when it's on there, once you warm it up, you're gonna wanna walk around it. If you start pulling on it, you could stretch it and break it. So you'll see a slight bump in it. I put in it right here. Because what I did is as I warmed it, I kind of wiggled it, and you'll find if you start pulling too hard, it'll want to pull apart. And I just went in here and kind of just lifted it and kind of helped it, and then it just, boom, it came off. So this one only has one rib, it's not too bad. So we got to make sure we're very careful with this one. The other one, we just worry about the lid. So here's the fuel pump factory. We can go ahead and toss that. We can toss the original clamp because we supply a new one. So now that we have everything ready, it's time to put the pump in the basket. Here's the pump. We're gonna do a little prep for the pump before we put it in, just to make it easier. Well, obviously first we want to put the pickup screen on it. It only goes on one way. Snaps in like that, and it's got a key on it. And this is where this little star clip goes on to help retain it. Theoretically, if it was put in, it should never come off, but if you ever have to take it apart or during installation, you might accidentally dislodge it, so it's best that this gets installed. It's gonna be a little bit of a pain to install. So you gotta pull it over the plastic. So usually a couple screwdrivers or a socket from the top gets that on. So now I got the little lock clip on there. I just walked it down. It doesn't have to be on super far, it doesn't have to be super tight. It's more just to accidentally keep this from falling off. I'm gonna get the pump, set up to go in here. We tend to put it in with the connector facing this way. It really doesn't matter too much of how this is gonna go in there. But we found like right about there, if you can see, because it'll start hitting over here. And you see our bracket, you wanna hold down our bracket. It fits very neatly on here. This is about the best orientation because the sock starts hitting this one portion. So what we're gonna wanna do is we're gonna wanna push a little bit of pressure right here. So we're gonna hold the metal bracket down, the JHM bracket, and we're gonna wanna push down, keeping the pump in location, and we're gonna wanna just get a Sharpie mark on the bracket and the pump if you can. Sometimes there's a better angle back here, or you just mark on the bracket right where this top, see this top edge? So I can just mark on the bracket where the top edge is, so I have an orientation point, because we're gonna wanna clamp it up so when it goes together, it fits well. And I'll pull it out. Cool thing about marking in a couple places. So I'm just gonna line it up like this and clamp it on to our bracket. That's just done with the clamps. So we'll tighten these up and get this thing squared up. So now we got the bracket on there. You can see where I lined it up near the top edge of my mark. The big key is, you don't have to be that perfect, but if you just check it a couple times, you can always re-loosen the clamps and redo it. You know you're good when you set it in here and it lines up like that with our stuff, but when you lift it, see how it lifted itself a little bit? I push it down and it just comes up about 1 millimeter or 2. That just means it's pushed down in there, it's nice and snug at the bottom, so it'll do really well if you ever have, you know, really low tank of gas. That's usually the only issue you run into on why the car would completely die at an idle when it says it has more than 0 miles left to go. So one more thing before I go ahead and lock it down with 3 screws, just to make it easier. This is when I usually throw the main fuel line on. So you're gonna wanna get the clamp in place. The orientation of this doesn't matter. It's gonna be snug. These are factory style lines. If you wanna warm it up a little bit, that's okay. Just don't get it too hot. Especially if it's winter time, you're gonna probably wanna do that. See, about 80 degrees out here right now. It takes some effort. So if you need to warm it up, just get it down pretty good so then you're beyond the lip, and then the clamp can sit in a good spot below the lip. You shouldn't have to get this too tight because these are nice OEM style lines. Just want to make sure when you tighten, you don't ram that into the connector. Phillips screwdriver should be all you need. And I'm just going to double check my clamps here because I know I'm at a good height. Snap my electrical connector in here for now. So this is pretty much good to go, at least from this bottom portion. Put that in there. And then you're going to want to use a screw gun to run these 3 in. They're self-tapping. You can see it lines up perfectly with that. You want to make sure it lines up with this half moon because the metal drops there. And I'll run these 3 screws in with just a electric screw gun. Now the bottom assembly is basically done with the 3 screws in. Big thing is, you know, as long as it's clear around here, you're fine. It doesn't have to be that critical. So the 3 self-tappers, don't tighten them too tight. They'll strip a little bit easily. So once again, those will strip easily. You'll also notice sometimes you end up with black plastic in the bottom, so blow it out again. This portion is pretty much ready to go. We got the hose on, the electrical connector on. It's in there, it's preloaded, it's tight. The next thing we're going to need to beat is the check valve assembly. That's going to then hook to the hose in order to help stir the tanks correctly. First step with that, so you're going to need to assemble all of this. And you're going to want to use a nice Teflon thread sealant, something that can be automotive grade. We tend to use Permatex. This one's high temperature. They make another non-high temperature. We use this on everything, so we just have this laying around. You can see it's pretty beat up. This is part number 59235. And this is all we use. So we're going to want to hook to the T. And the big thing is the arrow. There's an arrow on the check valve. It needs to face away from the T, so out of the T. You don't need a lot. Do not use Teflon tape. It doesn't do well with this stuff, with fuel. These kind of... We're going to screw that on there. Looks like this stuff's been sitting for a while. So this has been sitting for a while. It's a little gooey, but usually you want to wait till it gets white. I got it white off screen. So I got it tight, arrow facing out. I'm gonna go to the bench and tighten everything up. Remember, you're dealing with fuel, so it's gotta be pretty darn tight. So I'll just vise this, I'll tighten all these fittings, and I'll be right back. So now we're gonna assemble the hose onto the valve. This valve's all tightened up now with the Teflon sealing paste. Our pinch clamp slides on. I've already warmed this up with the heat gun, so it'll go on. It's usually pretty hard to get on there. Kind of walk it. If you get 2 ribs and you warmed it up with the heat gun, it really doesn't matter how it's oriented. This thing's very flexible. But I got past 2, about halfway down the next. That way you can clamp it. You need a little bit of gap right there, and you don't want to be near the end. So just split the difference. So you'll almost be sitting on the first rib it went over. And the easiest way to clamp these is just a pair of side cutters. Don't have to be crazy tight, but you just go ahead and get it all the way. It'll bottom out all the way. So this is the assembly ready for the crossover on the tanks. That's just done. Now we need to prep the wires and the rest of the assembly. We're almost done. Okay, we're getting near the finish here. We got our crossover valve assembly done. Next thing I want to do is some prep on the wiring. So on the factory wires, the yellow and the black at the pump lid side, I usually just cut them at 7 inches. We're not going to crimp now. We're just getting it easy. It's easy to measure right now, so it's a good time to do it. Keep in mind, just because the black is black on the pump and this lid, if you look in the lid, it actually says plus. So the black is truly positive on the Audi inside the pump. If you go to the pump, you'll also see that the black is positive. So yeah, that's confusing. It's just how the Germans do things different from us. So I go 7 at the pump side, and then I go ahead and I go 5. I meant 7 at the lid side, 5 at the pump side. That way it's just cut and done. So this is ready to go. Next step for the lid is getting the clamp and line on there. And like I said, these are pretty tight. Yeah, this one's definitely very tight. We're gonna need to warm this up, and I'm gonna slip that on. You see it goes on a lot easier. Alright, this just passed the second ramp. So I went ahead and tightened it up while it's still warm, so it actually will help it dig in deeper. Just make sure you don't ruin it. It's really easy to, you know, when you warm it up, you always want to keep your heat near the end. So this is ready to go. So now is a good time to see how it sits. And then you figure out where everything goes from there. You can see the spring one goes here by the notch, and the small one goes here. So why you set the lid in is it helps you figure out how you want to lay it out. That way you can figure out how you're going to want to do the wires and how you're going to want to set this in there. And it's going to hang out a little bit. And also you want to think about how it sits in the car. But this is just a good point to look at everything, start lining it up, keep everything from getting tangled so you don't get too far ahead of yourself. We can go ahead and drop the level center back in. And it's real easy for the wires, like I just had happen. I got a wire trapped down inside. Just gonna make sure it gets a nice clean shot when you drop it back in, that there's no wires in there, and then it's in there. I now got the fuel line laid out like this. You'll notice you can see this goes towards the rear of the car. So the best way I found is just let the check valve like point backwards like this, because it tends to go over to the other side. I have a factory pump here for comparison's sake. It has it poke out over here. So if you look, you know, we're actually going to be further out. The fact that it hangs out is not a big deal. This is just going to be sitting in fuel. You also want to make sure that this lid goes way down if you did anything out of sync. So the next step, now that we got this sitting like this, there is a way to tuck this all inside and have your fittings inside. It just becomes a little bit, you know, troublesome worrying about kinking it. So I got the fitting tied in like this, into the T. I had to warm these up and I clamped them. Like I said, it's not crazy critical. The biggest thing is you want to make sure that this can go up with this not there. So we're going to use some zip ties and we're going to pull it this way a little bit. That's the only concern, is if this is like way over here. And you just got to, as you get it into the tank, you just got to slip this stuff all in there. So here you go. So I've got it pretty much assembled. You can see the two metal portions from the lid. The spring one goes here inside of the notch, and then the other one goes in there. You see how I laid it out? For reference, this is towards the rear of the car. You want to kind of push down and make sure nothing's catching, and make sure this spins freely, moves freely, sorry. I went ahead and tightened this up, and I laid it like this. That way it can hook to the other side of the tank and clip in where you removed it from the car. When we hook it together, we're going to zip tie it up like this. That way we give this a little bit of room, and this will sit like this. You're only going to have a problem if you like really put this up over this arm. So the next step is to go ahead and, like I said, for tangle sakes, I didn't connect the electrical yet. So I'm going to crib the red to black and the yellow to this black. So the yellow from the lid to the black on the pump, the red from the pump to the black on the lid. And like I said, if you actually look at the lid, it'll show a positive sign at the black, and the pump does the same as well. So I'm gonna hook the electrical, do a couple zip ties, and we'll be ready to stick it in the car. So now I got the electrical connections done. Yellow from the lid to black at the pump, black from the lid to red at the pump. Like I said, you can actually see the positive side under the lid and on the pump. For whatever reason, they just do it different from us. So this is where we use some zip ties. I like to get one right here to help hold this together, and then some electrical held up. Usually we just grab everything on this line, mainly just to keep it out of the way. So I'm just gonna zip tie this up here, and we're gonna go ahead and grab this at the same time. Actually, we're gonna skip it because we don't want to have these wires touching the brass at all. That would be bad. I'm gonna go a little bit past here, lock this up. Like I said, this isn't the most pleasing to the eye, but we've been running this for years with no issues. So there you go. That's gonna help give it room for this to sweep. You can see I just ran a zip tie there. And then the electrical, you can just grab that separately right around the same spot. Leave some slack on the bottom and the top. So when you put it in the car, it's going to need some slack. And you just cut it off. So one to help hold the fitting up to the big line, one to hold the wires, make sure everything's clear. Push down on the lid. You see how it moves. And you're good. You get it back in the car. When you put it back in the car, it takes a little work to finagle it in and get it in, and you gotta drop the hose into here and hook this up to the other side. You'll have plenty of slack. So there you go. Ready to go in the car. Like I said, there's a way to go ahead and pre-assemble a lot of this below and then hook it up to the top later and hide this fitting inside. You're welcome to try that. This is just a lot less technical for bigger, especially bigger hands.